Welcome back to The Nuance. I know our relationship is brand new, it's fresh, and as such, I probably shouldn't have lied to you on day one, but I did. I told you that this show wasn't going to be full of me rambling on talking to myself, that it was going to consist of a real conversation with real people, with you. What I should have said was that it's going to consist of relevant and insightful conversation to help real people, to help you. So if you allow me to amend my initial declaration and talk to you solo from time to time, I think that sharing what I'm talking about, what I'm working on with my clients would be insightful and helpful to you. And now, before we get into any one-on-one calls, is a good a time as any, because something came up in one of my client check-ins this week, and I think it's relevant to those that will be listening. Because the discussions that we're going to be having here are going to be centered around adjustments and manipulations to habits, behaviors, diets, exercise regimens, so on and so forth. They're going to be about making changes to what you're currently doing, either because you don't know where to start or what you're currently doing isn't working. And that second part is what I want to focus on today. What you're currently doing. Is it actually not working, or is it not actually happening? If I think about it, what I really want to talk about here is impulse control. And if I really think about it, impulse control may be the top reason that people fail on their pursuit of their health and fitness goals. The obvious way would be overindulging, eating too many pastries, drinking too many beers, things like that. The less obvious way is jumping from diet to diet, workout program to workout program, at any and all signs, or at least thought to be signs, of setback. So in the client check-in that I mentioned, there was some back and forth over concern about the scale increasing over a couple of days. And with the concern immediately came the what should we do, what do we need to change questions. And I know that that's not a foreign or unfamiliar situation for many people. As a coach and someone who spends a substantial amount of time on the health and fitness side of social media, I see a lot of people set health and fitness goals for themselves. Start new diets, join workout classes, sign up for a new app, buy new supplements. And then I also hear a lot of, this isn't working. Why isn't this working? What do I need to do differently? Don't get me wrong, absolutely. Sometimes something needs to change. We need to adjust our plan. But before we do that, we have to make sure that the plan itself is actually faulty, and that adherence to the plan isn't the real issue. We have to differentiate between what we need to do differently and what we actually need to do, or what we need to do better. Now, that alone isn't actually helpful. I know that. Simply telling somebody to do better, to stop cheating on their diet, to stop skipping workouts, almost never leads them to actually doing so. But setting solid, concrete, tangible, non-negotiable parameters is. Identifying boxes that you require to be checked off to give yourself permission, the justification to say, the outcome I'm seeing warrants a change to the inputs. Things you must do, or else you cannot say, it's not working. What kinds of things are we talking about here? In the specific client situation I'm referencing, we agreed on these. 90 ounces of water every day, 4 or less meals out on the week, 6,000 steps per day, and falling within a more narrow calorie intake range that was previously more flexible. But we could also get more specific with these non-negotiables, with things like a certain number of alcoholic drinks per week, all food portions being weighed instead of eyeballed, no bites, licks, or tastes going unaccounted for, getting a certain number of hours of sleep per night or being in bed by a certain time every single night, and completing all programmed workouts and cardio sessions. Now, there's also the consideration of adjusting your plan because it's not the right plan for you. For example, if you're trying to fit in 7 workouts in a week that only has time and space for 3, or if you're trying to meal prep every single meal that you eat, but you travel for work 5 days out of the week. Those are causes for changing your protocols. They shouldn't be a part of your plan, but for different reasons. Not because they aren't working or that they don't work, but because they don't fit into your life. What we're talking about right now are actions, behaviors, habits, systems that are realistic for you to follow through with. When your plan is made up of those, we can then use one of my favorite coaching tools, an if-then statement. If X, then Y. If I'm checking off all of these boxes and I'm not losing weight, I'm not building muscle, then the actions and behaviors in those boxes should be adjusted. This may seem like an obvious concept, but you'd be surprised at how often this thought process is bypassed, how often adherence levels are 70% or lower, and that which is supposed to be adhered to gets discredited, gets deemed as ineffective. So if you're following a generic eat healthier and exercise more approach, if you see someone share a diet plan, a workout program, a a 30-day challenge. If you hear me recommend certain approaches, regardless of what any of that entails or doesn't, get specific. Cover as many bases as you can. Identify your unique boxes to check off. Create your own non-negotiables. And only modify your approach when you're following through with them, when you're checking them off, and the outcome that you're seeing isn't what you're intending. Or if modifying the approach is what's needed to actually be able to follow through with it. I say all of this because, again, impulse control in this regard is what keeps so many people on that hamster wheel, spinning in circles, starting and stopping over and over again, never really getting anywhere. Because every time they start, it's with the expectation to make progress as fast as possible. And that expectation is what ultimately ends up leading to jumping ship every time progress doesn't come as fast as possible. So maybe the main takeaway here isn't actually be specific with tangible tasks and behaviors. Maybe it's not make sure you're actually doing what you think you're doing. Maybe it's the thing that you haven't tried is small incremental behavior change that may seem ineffective in the short term. Maybe it's implementing habits that you can sustain for years to come, not just for a few weeks so you see a certain number on the scale. And maybe it's what you're doing actually is working, just on a smaller scale than you'd like. Funny enough, in that client check-in, we actually saw an average weekly weight that was down, not up. So another consideration is how you are quantifying and measuring success. What outcome metrics are you looking at? Individual daily weigh-ins don't tell the whole story. How you look in one outfit doesn't tell the whole story. How you look in one picture doesn't tell the whole story. You can't justify changing something by saying it's not working if it actually is. Objectivity. That is the ultimate goal. That's the reminder that I'm trying to give here. Objectivity allows for rational, logical, evidence-based decision-making. Those things increase consistency with habits and behaviors. And increased consistency is what leads to sustainable change and sustainable progress. And that's probably what you're really after, whether it seems that way or not. Keep that in mind as you listen on and start to hear more direct advice from me in the calls that are starting next week. Now, in addition to this preface, this before backhanded advice that I want to give to you before we really get into the meat and potatoes of this show, of this podcast, I also let people know on my Instagram at Coach John Knoll that I would do a Q&A session at the end of this recording today. So I got a couple of responses over the course of the day yesterday that I'm going to go through one at a time. I left it open to be either personal or related to health and fitness goals, personal meaning about me. And the only one that actually came through that was personal in any regard was this one that says, would love to hear from your wife on the pod. Does she train too? What's it like being married to a fitness coach? Does she feel pressured to be in good shape? And I do have a wireless mic. I could walk out here right now and put her on the spot and ask her these questions, but I won't do that. I will save this for a later date, a later time. She will be a quote unquote guest on the show at some point, I promise you. But a couple of other questions that came through that I want to go through one-on-one to give you a little bit more of a nuanced answer that I could on an Instagram story with a single slide or a single video that can only be a minute long on that platform. Starting with how to lose weight while becoming a faster runner and not engaging in disordered eating. And with questions like this, we have to then consider the obvious thing that we're discussing here, the nuance, right? And specifically in regards to these couple of things, what does disordered eating actually mean, right? Because that is unique, that is relevant, that is individual to you, because how we lose weight in any capacity, in any situation, is always going to be the same. It's going to be being in a calorie deficit. It's going to be burning more calories than we are consuming on average over time. It's the how do we do that that really matters. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can go about quantifying and modifying and moderating our calories in and our calories out, right? And different people have different opinions, have different experiences with certain methods and strategies to do each one of those. Some people might find tracking calories and macros to be disordered. Some people might find that to be extremely beneficial. Some people might find following a specific meal plan and completely eliminating or restricting certain foods that aren't on it to be disordered. Some people might find that beneficial for consistency. So ultimately, the generic answer is you need to be eating the appropriate amount of calories that accounts for your activity, your recovery, that creates a slight caloric deficit while also taking into account and considering your hunger, your energy levels, because you are also trying to adapt and improve your performance outcomes as well, which does require some recovery capacity, right? So you're sacrificing a couple of things here and there. My advice in a situation like this would be to not be in a substantial or extreme a high magnitude deficit, because you're going to end up being hungrier, because you're also running a lot and you're running fast, because you are going to be under recovered, and thus your energy level is going to drag. And throughout the day, you might end up moving less, and your overall activity as a whole, even though you are running, might decrease, and that might actually pull you out of a deficit. So in that way, eating too few calories might actually be unfavorable. It might backfire. And so you might have to make sure that you are eating more than you are now. It just depends on where you're currently coming from. So eating the appropriate amount of food for a weight loss goal doesn't always necessarily just mean, hey, if it's not happening the way that you want to have it, that you want it to be happening right now, that means you need to eat less. No, it might mean you need to eat more. You need to increase your high carbohydrate intake. You might need to increase your overall calorie intake, because that's going to actually support the other side of the equation and balance things out so that you are not hungry, tired, lethargic, forcing you or leading you to then eating more, whether it be unintentionally, moving less unintentionally, so on and so forth, right? So the question is, how can you moderate your dietary intake in a way that's not disordered to you? How can you sustain your overall activity levels in a way that is not unsustainable for you? This is why these one-on-one conversations are needed, because I don't know what you're doing right now. I don't know how much you're eating right now. I don't know how long you've been eating that much for, and how much you have been running as much as you are now, right? And how that is changing over time, if the mileage is going up, if it's going down, if you're pushing pace. All of those things matter, because they have an effect on both calories in and calories out, which, yes, it is that simple when it comes to weight loss, but it's never actually that simple. It's nuanced, right? Next question, and I apologize, of course, when I'm doing this, there are landscape people cutting the grass right outside my window here, so you're probably hearing that. We'll pass here in a second. But the next question is, I make a protein coffee every morning, and I'm thinking of switching to Legion. Just curious if you've ever mixed any Legion proteins with coffee, and if it was good. Stick to vanilla or switch it up. So I will give you my honest opinion here. I think that whey protein, period, in general, doesn't matter what the company is. It doesn't matter if it's whey isolate, if it's whey concentrate, if it's casein. Warm, heated, cooked, tastes disgusting. I've never liked it in anything, whether it be liquid, whether it be in oats. Granted, I will consume overnight oats with whey protein in it. I just always consume it cold. It's never actually cooked. It's never warmed. It's never heated. The people who like putting protein powder into oatmeal warm, it's always after the fact, after the oatmeal is already cooked. You never put the protein in first and then cook it, because it just doesn't taste good to me. So no, I have not actually done it, but I also don't drink or like coffee, so I'm not the right person to ask about this. I know that my wife has, with different flavors, I think both vanilla and salted caramel, the Legion flavors, and she enjoys it as somebody who truly does like coffee. So is it doable? Sure. I would stick to vanilla, salted caramel, or there is a mocha cappuccino flavor that, as somebody who doesn't like coffee, I really like that flavor on its own. That would also probably be paired well with coffee, as long as it's in the right ratio and you aren't overpowering the powder aspect with liquid. Because if you put an entire scoop of protein in 1 cup of coffee, it's going to be way too much powder and not enough liquid. It's going to be chalky, clunky. You're going to be chewing and eating it as opposed to drinking it, and that's disgusting. Next question here is, when's the first episode with a guest going to be? Been considering filling out your form about being a guest, but on the fence and don't want to be the first. So today is Wednesday, December 11th. A week from today, December 18th, is my first scheduled booked recording live call with somebody who has health and fitness goals that they want advice on, where we're going to be diving into the nuance. So very shortly, it is coming. It may be the next episode of this show that gets published after this one, depending on if something else comes up in a client check-in that I think would be relevant, insightful, and helpful to talk about. it may or may not be the next call or the next show that you hear. And then I think this might be the last question that came. No, there's a couple more. So this one's a little bit more in depth, which always helps give a nuanced answer. Let's say you were lifting consistently for a long time, years, and then took 6 months off. Obviously lost strength over that time, picking up dumbbells again now. Will it take as long to build back up to where I was, or is there kind of a bonus to having once been able to do this 6 months ago? Fantastic question. And the answer actually isn't all that nuanced, unless we wanted to get into the weeds in terms of how long it actually takes to see regressions from a muscular physiological standpoint, because you already acknowledged the fact here that there are certainly going to be neurological and motor unit recruitment, form, execution, technique modifications and adjustments and regressions that occur relatively quickly. Lifting is a skill as much as it is an adaptation from building more muscle. It's being able to use that muscle, right? And a lot of that has to do with just kind of like our brain neuroplasticity and the way that adapts and allows us to be more proficient with moving our body through space. That can happen relatively quickly in terms of if you stop doing something within a week, you probably start to regress a little bit on the skill. But if we want to get into specifics about how long it actually takes to lose muscle tissue, to physiologically change, I don't know the exact answer. Nobody really does. It's probably a matter of weeks. But the answer to your question, again, is not all that nuanced, because it is yes. Muscle memory is a very, very real thing here, where if we're talking about strength, if we're talking about the size of our muscle tissue, of losing muscle and building it, it takes a substantial amount more time to gain that fitness initially than it does to regain it. It will always come back more quickly. I don't think there's any actual metrics in terms of specifics, but I would probably say it's safe to bet that it would take less than half the time in most cases. Obviously, that depends on how long we're talking about here, because you could take 2 weeks off versus 2 years. But taking 6 months off, I would say probably within a month, which is certainly less than half the time, that you will be back to where you were, both from a muscularity standpoint and from a strength standpoint. These things come back really quick relative to the lengthy amount of time it takes to build them in the first place. And last question here, can calories stay at maintenance when bedridden with the flu if appetite is there? And this comes off as asking for permission to continue to eat the same amount of calories. And I think that is certainly different than the question of do the same calories end up being your maintenance calories when you are bedridden? The answer to that is no. If you are going from, let's say, walking 10,000 steps per day and lifting weights 4 times per week to now you are in bed all day long doing nothing across the week, the amount of calories required to sustain yourself will absolutely be lower. They will decrease. And so your maintenance intake will be lower if we're talking about purely maintaining homeostasis, maintaining the state at which your body is in now. But in terms of what I think you're really asking is, should you? Can you eat the same amount of food if you are not exercising as much or moving as much as you typically do? And yes, you can. Oftentimes, I believe you probably should, especially in a situation like this where recovery demand is now increased because of an illness. Sometimes, depending on the severity, we could also be talking about injury here as well. The amount of nourishment that your body needs in order to recover, because it is not necessarily at homeostasis right now, right? It is fighting to get back there. It is fighting against an illness, which takes energy. There's an energy demand and cost to that. It actually kind of needs a little bit more nourishment. At least, I'm assuming it does. And so it might actually be the right decision to not just go by the number, so to speak, and say, oh, well, my calories out have now reduced, so should my calories in. Maybe the right answer is I'm going to eat the same amount of food and make sure that I continue to nourish myself, especially if you're not having grand oppositions to food, which often does come with things like illness, with things like the flu, yeah, it probably is a good idea to fuel your body optimally, not reduce food just because you're not burning that amount of energy every single day, and get yourself back to a place where you are fully recovered more quickly, because it likely will happen more quickly if that's the way that you go about it, as opposed to trying to just match the numbers, match the data, and be hyper focused on that, and then undernourish yourself and extend the amount of time that you are now sick. So hopefully that answers the question that you actually asked, but also gave you something to think about in regards to, what this also says to me. And that's all the questions that came in from the Q&A. Again, there's a potential that the next time that you hear my voice, it is not just me rambling to you by myself solo, but rather on a live call, giving my advice, my recommendation in terms of how to help our first caller when it comes to their health and fitness goals. And as always, if you found this discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe on whatever platform that you turn in. Remember that there are never any right answers. There's just nuance. I'm John Knoll. Thanks for listening.